Thanks for joining us for a session on open banking, in particular focusing on API security. We're joined by Jacqueline Painter from Okta to discuss a deep dive into some of the issues facing open banking APIs and how to start to resolve them. Jacqueline, over to you.
Great. Well, let's dive right into it. So, as many of you know, the financial services landscape is quickly evolving, and due to the past year and a half, it's really accelerated a lot of digital business plans outside of just banking, but more so in the banking industry. It's had a really big impact. So there's kind of three main drivers that I categorize what we're seeing in the marketplace. One of the big ones is consumer behaviors are changing. So there's a whole new generation of consumers that are entering the marketplace and will start to take over the marketplace here in a few years. These are typically millennials and Gen Zers, and what we're seeing is they have a different preference of how they interact with all companies. For banks specifically, they want this seamless, frictionless experience, kind of my way anyway, and this instant gratification. And loyalty with financial institutions is changing as well. It's no longer, who have I been banking with the longest, or who has a bank branch location that's close in proximity. It's really about who can provide me the experience that I'm looking for. Some great examples, even from my perspective, is when I moved to Colorado about 11 or 12 years ago. We banked with Bank of America in New Mexico, and we moved to Colorado. They didn't have a Bank of America, and so we ended up moving over to a different financial institution because of that. Now, that is not going to be a requirement for a lot of different consumers. And so the dynamic and how we interact with banks specifically is really changing and driving banks to really change their model as well. And then we really can't not mention COVID-19, even though I know we would all love to, but that's really accelerated and changed digital banking as well. From your workforce with call center agents, working remotely, business partners that you would typically interact with is all being done remotely and virtual and through partner portals. Most online shopping is happening and has continued to increase, and engaging with your customers is all being virtual as well, like creating a new account with the bank. You can all do that remotely now with digital onboarding and ID proofing and those type of things. And then compliance and regulation. That's always kind of changing the financial services landscape. There's a lot more that we could list here, but really for this conversation, it's around PSD2 and open banking. And this compliance has really transcended across the globe. So you're seeing different forms of PSD2 and open banking regulations taking place in other countries, but then you're also seeing best practices that are starting to evolve because a lot of organizations are seeing the benefit of this customer experience that consumers are able to experience. So just a quick overview of open banking. This was started in 2018 by the European Union. They had a form of payment services and they expanded it to PSD2. And it's really around making sure that you're protecting the customers better, you're making sure that the transactions they make are secure, and that you are able to promote innovative services through this open banking concept. And it's really giving consumers control of their data. One big example for me is, another one is when I was banking with Chase at one point, and I did not have access to all of my other accounts. So I would use Mint typically to kind of get a full view of my portfolio. And now Chase is really starting to implement a lot of these open banking concepts. I now have different access to all of the different other banking applications that I use through Chase, and I get a whole view of my portfolio. So this open banking concept, I don't think is going anywhere. There's different regulations, like I had mentioned. Australia has the CDR, Japan has the Revised Banking Act, and these are all kind of from PSD2 and open banking. So just important to know that it's not going anywhere, and it's going to continue to evolve. So the power of open banking. This is one of my favorite slides, just because I've been a part of this open banking discussion for a few years now, and it's just amazing to see how much it's grown. One of the predictions I had was that it would start to evolve over into North America, at least as a best practice, and we're starting to see that. So that really excites me. There's a couple of different stats that I want to call out. So on the left-hand side, this came from openbanking.org. And so they have a website for the UK that really discusses everything open banking. You can find a list of providers and third-party providers on that site that you can look to connect with. One of the big things here is that there's 300 fintechs and innovative providers that have joined the ecosystem in the past 3 years, which I think is just phenomenal. And then you look to the right, and this is a survey that we did in North America to 100 leaders within the banking, retail banking space. And this was just a little overwhelming in the sense that everybody agrees that fintech providers is a threat to their organization. Over 80% of banking leaders agreed with this sentiment. And it was really around providing new products and services and experiences for their customers, and then making sure that they prioritize securing these open APIs that we're seeing with open banking. And so again, these are just great stats to kind of have and see that all banks are really taking note of what's happening in the marketplace, whether they're in North America or they're across the globe in different regions. This is definitely top of mind for a lot of retail banks and financial institutions. So this kind of sums up that experience I gave you with Chase. This is before open banking. Obviously, you're seeing the user doesn't really have control much of their data or their experience. It's very transaction centric, and this is how it used to be with banking. And now it's going to completely change. It already has completely changed. So today it's very consumer centric, and it really gives the ability for the user to have control over their data. And you'll see that third-party provider in the orange circle, and they're really kind of the gateway to all these different services and offerings. And so what that does is it gives the user more flexibility to share their data, get insights into their financial wealth, and also get new products and services that they never were able to have before. So this is just very powerful for the consumer, and I'm sure it's going to continue to evolve, but this is really what it looks like today. So with open banking comes new obligations for financial institutions. So, because banks have to open up their APIs to supply customer data to all these different third-party providers, there's a lot of regulations in place on how you make this secure. In addition, it's making sure that consumers can give consent and have the right privacy in place across every experience and every kind of stage of the buyer's journey. And so this is really important as well, is that not only do we have to provide better customer experiences, but we also need to make sure that they're secure. And with that are the security risks. So here's just a quick list of some kind of security risks to think about. On the right-hand side, again, this was done from the survey that we conducted through a third party at Okta. And it was really about, what are the top security concerns when it comes to opening up your API. And then on the left-hand side, these are just kind of some things to think about. So open banking in general, it's a very known concept, but security experts, it can be very limited. So making sure that you have the right kind of processes in place and that knowledge in place to kind of help execute and make sure that API security is kind of at the forefront. So a lot of times when we're improving the customer experience and really leaning on developers, developers are there to really get your product to market quickly and provide this better experience for all of your users, but they're not security experts. And so this can lead to data exposures if the company is kind of not thinking about this proactively. And this leads into shadow API. So this probably isn't as a big of a deal to financial services and fintech providers specifically, but there are chances that maybe the security team is not aligned with the developers, and there's applications that have open APIs that they're not aware of, or open APIs that aren't valid anymore, and making sure that those are shut down. And then, this open API concept really makes it easy for data theft. And so these are all things to kind of keep top of mind as you're working through your business strategy to implement this open banking experience. And with that, I will give it over to Nathaniel. Thank you.
Thanks, Jax, for that phenomenal introduction in terms of what threats APIs are facing. Now, one of the great things that the open banking ecosystem has really done is to put together this financial API pattern, right? And this really has become that gold standard, right? What's going on from a security construct? How do you protect against it? And then they've made it applicable, or at least it's been adopted, I guess is a fair way of saying it, by most of the major standards bodies across the world, right? And whether that's Brazil, Australia, UK, EU, or even North America, there's been a massive adoption of FAPI 1.0 and input into FAPI 2.0 for the who, what, where, why, how of how you're going to do security around your APIs. And so if we look at that, right, and we start to think about, hey, what types of security is FAPI really bringing to bear, right? We start off with pairwise identifiers, making sure that there's a unique identifier that is mutable as well as identifiable from both the client and servers. Second piece is strong customer authentication, right? SCA. And this regulatory piece is really designed to prevent online transaction fraud. This got started in PSD2, where you could do a transactional authorization. So much more than just kind of your session-based authorization, but really getting down to individual transactional levels. We've seen a massive shift in OAuth as well, right? As it's moved from OAuth 2 to OAuth 2.1 in the same bearing, meaning let's move from long-lived sessions into very contextual-based authorization within individual transactions. The third is mutual TLS support, right? And this is where the client and server are authenticating each other strongly, including certificate-bound access tokens. So making sure that the access token that's been presented has been appropriately signed, as well as taking care of the transport layer security, making sure the client as well as the service are correctly authenticated and authorized to speak to each other. Fourth one is DCR. So DCR exists in OAuth by itself. However, open banking has kind of taken it to the next level. In fact, we've even extended that a little bit to automate DCR in new and more secure ways. And so what DCR is doing, it's allowing clients to actually register in real time two different services or two different OAuth authorization services to identify themselves, send over registration data, send over either pairwise identifiers or send over secure software assertions, right? And be able to bring that data back to ensure that they are indeed allowed to register as a client to that service. That SSA, right, is that software statement validation. I just referred to it in the DCR, where you have again, a certificate bound identifier, a validator, right, that you're able to submit as part of your dynamic client registration. Fourth piece is reporting, right? Making sure that the KPIs wrapped around open banking are really, designed to present back up to the business exactly what's transpiring. How are you protecting against it? How are you showing both the business value, right? How many new developers, how many new applications, et cetera, are being done, as well as how many net new transactions, and then how have those transactions been protected? Are you using older OAuth pieces, such as the implicit flow that are have been designated insecure, or are you actually bringing kind of the newer PXE-based OAuth, right? So being able to give you a full picture of exactly what's transpiring across your open banking APIs. SIBA is a little bit of a variant of the SCA piece, right? Where again, we've got this client-initiated back channel authentication. In FAPI 1, to be honest, very, very complicated, hard for developers to implement, and very minimal adoption, I think is a fair way to say it. Now, it's being flattened, being made easier. CDR actually did some excellent work around that for developers to implement, as well as to carry forward the context of the transaction into the authentication or into that pushed authentication transaction. Lastly is dynamic consent. So being able to layer on top very fine-grained authorization, not just what's in the transaction, but also what the application or what the service, the open banking service, can know about the user, right? So it's no longer authorization of what can I do, but also what can you know about me, and even what can you share about me. And this is really where fine-grained authorization, progressive uh, profiling has taken its next step, right, into this progressive consent manner. So the other piece that's facing APIs, right, are OWASP API threats. And so when we take a quick peek, and these were first released in October 2019, very interesting piece because these are things facing not just the open banking ecosystem, but all APIs out there. And so we saw that there was 10 different OWASP API top 10 threats, hence the nomenclature. And when we actually start to dive into them, we see 7 of the top 10 uh, are all wrapped around authentication, authorization, a little bit of audit, right? And this becomes incredibly important as identity, not just of the user, but identity of the API or identity of the service. For example, usage in MTLS via certificate-bound tokens becomes increasingly important to protecting that service. And so we're going to dive into just the first one, right? The most pressing need from OAuth perspective. It's broken object level authorization and how to start mitigating that. So we look at broken object level authorization in conjunction with open banking, right? This would be, well, I want to actually do an object level transaction, or I want to authorize, for example, the payment of $10,000 off to somebody. So being able to implement identity aware object level authorization checks becomes critical for that, right? So it can't rely just on the ID that the client sends, but it has to actually start using centralized permissions privacy services. We're seeing also this emerge in the OAuth working groups, right? There's a net new grant management where a grant management standard where we're seeing the need to centrally manage all types of privacy and permissions. So it's not just the front door, what cookies can I use, or what cookies can the bank use or see about me. It's not just the open banking consent, but it's also the OAuth consent, and being able to bring all three of those together, right, into a common platform where you're managing all of the grants across all the services and across all the other connected banks. Second piece is checking that authorization, right? Making sure that each client request on an individual transaction level has has allowed you has been allowed by both the policies as well as by any authorizations or grants being issued by the client. Third piece is use random IDs, right? So making sure that you have these um, individual plugins into your API gateways, right, that are doing policy decision point right at the edge of your APIs or right at the edge of the service, for example, if you're using things like Kubernetes and Envoy. So when we look at of what's happening kind of under the covers, right, we see individual permissions that are set about, right, addressing the user and the transaction, and then addressing very fine-grained capabilities within that application. That application has its own unique identifier, right, that can be either certificate-based or random nonce, API key-based. We're going to push towards certificate-based as that gives us the most secure capabilities, as well as meets the mutual TLS requirements of of open banking. And then exactly what's happening, what resources are being granted, what objects are being accessed, and then how do you actually inculcate all of that as code, making sure that you're able to take your authorization policy and reuse it. So it's not hard coded into your application, but it's actually able to be reused across all of your APIs that are trying to access these different underlying objects. So that gives us this visibility, right? What ways are you going to authenticate or authorize an API? What's the standard for that API authentication? Make sure that you're using MFA at all points in time. Use very short-lived access tokens. So now as we've moved from the long-lived session-based access tokens to short-lived transactional access tokens, making sure that you have a TTL that's in the milliseconds, not in the seconds, not in the minutes, not in the hours, but literally that's only valid for as long as that access token is only valid for as long as that intent-based authorization is for. And then finally, like, how do you tie it all together, right? How do we use privacy as a key construct within authorization? So, Starting off with how do I build my session? How do I get my authentication context, right? Pull that out of a fantastic um, authenticator like Okta Verify. Marry that into that progressive consent, right? So we only get data when it's required, when it's going to be used by the application, when it's going to be passed on. Allow centralized management via the emerging OAuth grant management standards of exactly what user granted uh, what what user granted what privileges to what applications to know about them, right? Pull all that together in a complete privacy management policy so you know exactly what's transpiring, what you're sharing during the course of the transaction, and then finally store it in consent audit, right? And again, Contera has done a fantastic job here of building what we're calling, or what's being called Contera consent receipts, which is a tamper-proof audit of the who, what, where, why, when the grant was issued, and then stored in what we call the privacy ledger, right? So making sure that you have that tamper-proof audit of exactly what transpired at all points in time. In this way, when we look at things like broken object level authorization, we're able to very tightly control exactly how data is flowing, what data I'm granting an application to see, what data I'm trying to access within the application, and protect against things like broken object level authentications or authorizations, I'm sorry. So together, Okta Cloudentity pull all this together. This is kind of that requisite integration slide, covering everything from FAPI down to individual progressive consent and progressive profiling workflows, and then everything in between, whether it's EKYC, MFA, and very importantly, things like data lineage. So a user can know exactly where the data came from, what they granted access to, and what services and third parties are using it. Thank you for your time today. If you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out. My contact information is below. And thank you, Jacqueline, for joining us as well. Have a great day.